Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, and this is part 2 of our 3-part series with Dr. Debashish Banerji on the language of the gods. Dr. Banerji is the academic dean at the University of Philosophical Research. He is also an adjunct faculty at Pasadena City College and the California Institute of Integral Psychology. Furthermore, he is the author of several books, including Seven Quartets of Becoming, the Transformative Yoga based on the Diaries of Sri Aurobindo, and also Rabindranath Tagore in the 21st century, and a book about his great-grandfather, Abanindranath Tagore. Welcome again, Debashish.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Pleasure to be with you.
Likewise.
In our previous segment, we were talking about the concept of Maya. It's a Sanskrit word.
Yes.
It also represents a goddess.
Yes, it does.
And we were addressing some confusion about the meaning of the term because to some people, Maya is synonymous with illusion, but you were describing another way of looking at it.
Yes, indeed. So Maya as a term that means illusion actually comes out of some of the interpretations of the Upanishads, particularly the interpretations related to what is called Advaita Vedanta that was founded by the philosopher Shankara or Shankaracharya. So Shankara looked at Maya as an illusion-producing power of Brahman. And so he was trying to answer the question of the kind of experience we found ourselves in, which was an experience of falsehood in the sense that we experience things in a world of suffering. We experience the cessation of death. We experience ignorance, and hence we can't even function properly in the world due to our ignorance. So how did all this come about if Brahman or the divine is alone the truth that there is? So his answer was that this is a kind of a cinematic projection by some power of within Brahman, within the divine, within truth.
Yes.
And we are trapped within that cinema, you may say. And we take that for the reality. But if we can get out of it, then we can know truth as that which has projected this.
We're sometimes caught up in the movies of our lives.
Right. It's interesting that this kind of an explanation also has similarities with Plato's parable of the cave.
Yes.
Where the reality of the sun was outside the cave, but the shadows it threw was all that people saw. And they thought that that was the reality. So we are trapped in that world of shadows. To Shankara, what this meant was that we needed to get out from this appearance and get into the truth from which the projection came, the phenomenal projection came. And so that's why he saw Maya as an illusion-producing power. But other philosophers have seen it differently as just the creative power of Brahman that presents a certain kind of truth in a certain manifestation. But so long as we take that manifestation to be primary, then we are living within an illusion. It is a secondary reality, not an illusion, but really another kind of appearance of the truth. So if we know the truth, then we can engage with the world as we know it in a different way, in a truthful way. Now, that's the other way of looking at Maya, not as an illusion-producing power, but as a creative power which has the ability to show us its truth as well as the appearance.
The word, I understand it, well, there's several words, but one of the words for truth in Sanskrit is vidya, is it not?
True, absolutely, yes.
And the opposite of vidya is avidya.
Yes. So this is also, these two are, this duality is also an Upanishadic, the terms that come to us from the Upanishads.
Yes.
And literally speaking, the word vidya means knowledge. And so often you'll see it translated with a capital K, knowledge. And avidya is the opposite of vidya, so it's often translated as ignorance with a capital I. So this world of appearances that we talked about, the projection of Maya, if you want to call it that, it's being called the ignorance. And so, you hear the famous phrase, living in an ignorant world. Where is the ignorance? The idea of the ignorance is very interesting. If we see how they talk about what is ignorant in our experience, the notion is that all our experience of everything other than ourselves is inferred. We sense it. I can see you with my eyes, and I can create a picture of you in my brain.
Yes.
And I can talk to you as something which I imagine is actually sitting there, because you're actually happening inside my brain.
Your sensorium.
Right, inside my sensorium.
Or the sensorium of our viewers listening to this conversation.
Exactly.
Yes.
So whatever I know of you is being inferred by me from the data of the senses. I'm taking the symptoms that I'm seeing for the person that you are. But actually, you are not the sum of your symptoms. And if I really were to know you, if I were to have knowledge of you, I could only do that by being you. See, so otherwise, there is a certain kind of ignorance that I'm passing off as knowledge.
Yes.
So according to these seers or thinkers, or whatever knowledge we come to out of inference was a kind of ignorance. While the only true knowledge that we could have was if we could be whatever we wanted to know.
This is a very profound idea because it suggests through yoga that we can actually become these other alien beings or objects.
Absolutely. So there's a very famous Upanishad which fields this as a question, and it asks the question, is there something that can be known by which all things can be known? In other words, can we find the root of knowledge by which we can become anything in the universe and know it by being it? And the answer, of course, is Brahman. I mean, it's the one being there is, who by power of Maya appears to be many beings. So by yoga, if we can arrive at unity with that one, then we can extend that unity and know everything else by the power of identity.
And Brahman, in this sense, is like equivalent to the whole universe.
Brahman is equivalent to the consciousness of the whole universe and what is beyond the universe. Now, there is one conscious being, and that being has become this universe, and that being is Brahman.
Well, Brahman is often contrasted with Atman in Sanskrit.
Yes. That's another contrast. You're very right. As you said, Brahman and Maya form a certain pair. Vidya and Avidya form a pair. And then Brahman and Atman form a pair. And that pair relates to the relationship between the individual and the divine. So again, it answers the question, if there is only one, how come there are so many beings? And the answer that it gives is that one being is infinite, and therefore it can view itself infinitely. Just as if you were to reflect on yourself, you turn your attention, you introspect, you turn your attention within and try to tell yourself who you are or what you are. But if you were of infinite potency, you do that same thing at the same time infinitely. You have infinite pairs of eyes, as it were, to look at yourself. And each of these self-regards would result in a line of inquiry, one may say, towards self-knowledge. These are the souls. These are what are called Atmans. And so each creature, you, I, all of us, all our viewers, each one is a self-regard of Brahman. And in that sense, Brahman has become one of its ways of self-knowledge through each of these Atmans.
Sometimes I hear it said, it's like an equation, Brahman equals Atman.
Yes. Since Brahman has become all these forms that by which it knows itself, Atman is nothing other than Brahman. It's just another form of sort of self-regard of Brahman.
Does that mean that my innermost self is the same as the innermost self of the entire universe?
It's absolutely true. That's exactly what it means. It means that if we are to experience ourselves as the Atman, and then, of course, the later writings, and even in the Upanishads themselves, will more finely define the Atman as having different stations within us. And Tantric literature will talk about different chakras or centers. And the Atman resides in a different way in each of these centers. So what happens is that the idea of yoga to unite with our true identity as the Atman lets us know that we are just nothing other than the self-regard of Brahman. Each of us is the Brahman who has become one particular way of knowing itself. We were talking a little earlier about the parity of the one and the many.
Yes. This is a big issue, I suppose, in terms of the interaction and sometimes conflict between the monotheistic cultures and the polytheistic cultures.
Very true, Jeffrey. And so we find in the monotheistic religions, for example, what are called the Abrahamic religions, in the monotheistic interpretations, I'd say, because if we really probe these religions, we might find polytheism there too.
Oh, yes.
But if we look at the more mainstream monotheistic interpretations, we find that a dichotomy is set up between the one and the many. And if we are to worship the one God, we have to get rid of every appearance that can symbolize that God, or that can actually be something that relates to that God in a variety of ways.
Yes.
But the way in which the Indian tradition looks at it is that the one being is infinite, and hence it can look at itself in infinite ways. And each such way is a valid way of approaching the one. So polytheism and monotheism or monism are not contradictory in Hinduism. It is a complex monism, if we want to call it that.
Not so different from the idea, I suppose, of a trinity, only is more than three.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, in the Indian tradition, you have threes as well. So again, there's a very famous, interesting Upanishad in which a seer is asked the question, how many gods are there? And he answers, there are 333. There are also 33. There are also 3. There are 1.5. And there's 1. So he's talking almost of a ladder of being, by which the infinity of the world can connect with the one through, if necessary, steps or rungs of organized energies at the cosmic plane, which they're calling the gods.
Well, when it's suggested in the Sanskrit tradition that to really know another being or another object, you have to become that object, it's not just poetry like one might have in the metaphysical poetry of John Donne in the English tradition. It's accompanied with meditative exercises for attaining a state of consciousness where one merges with the object of contemplation.
Quite true, quite true. So we find that in ordinary and secular conversation, we talk about becoming somebody else through empathy. We say, I can empathize with you and feed your feelings. Actually, what we are saying is that there is a form of intuition that we are deploying that gives us a certain kind of knowledge, which is not just the knowledge by inference. We are capable of arriving at degrees of internal knowledge, which is not just the knowledge of inference using the mind and the senses. Then there is also the idea that two people who are very close can at times experience each other. There is a sense of actually thinking the same thought at the same time, having the same feelings, even seeing the same things in the same world. It's as if it's flavored by each other's people who are deeply in love, for example. These are forms of intuition where we exceed our ignorance and come close to knowledge with a capital K. So what we are being told here is that there are forms of meditation in which we can come into union with the divine or with even objects. So, the Upanishads are themselves literature for contemplation. And the idea is that contemplation takes certain stages, and they define these stages as stages of yogic contemplation. And the final stage is going to be identity, union. And if you have union, then you can extend that union into different forms of knowledge. You can have descriptive knowledge. By identity, you can then proceed to talk about the laws, the cognitive laws of that which you've become identical with. You can have emotional knowledge, and you can also have practical knowledge. In other words, you can be able to have the properties of what you have become identical with express themselves. You can express them in your own life, but you've really learned it through identity with something. So these are forms of knowledge.
Now, I am under the impression that in the West, we have many similar ideas expressed in poetry and in various monastic traditions here and there. The difference, as I understand it from my Western perspective, it's been suggested to me by philosophers, is that in the Vedantic tradition, you have a very extensive, very rigorous, logical, well-worked out, detailed, systematic understanding. And that's different than what we have in the Western tradition.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. It's a very detailed, systematic understanding and a very systematic process of practices that they, and there's different teachers, and these teachers have all created their own science, as it were, and technology, internal technology, to achieve these states. So I think that's exactly where, when we talk about the language of the gods, we're talking about an entire culture and a language, a form of expression of that culture, which is geared towards a systematic understanding and experience of these internal states.
That would suggest that ancient India, in the Vedantic periods, was a nation of yogis.
It may or may not have been a nation of yogis, but certainly there was a culture of yoga which was quite powerful, strong, and had its effects on society as a whole. I would certainly say that. At a certain point, the yogis became outsiders. They became sannyasis. They left society, but they were what one might call socially sanctioned outsiders. They kept coming in, and people gave them a lot of respect.
Perhaps akin to the Hebrew prophets.
Correct. And then also there were people within society who learned from them. They had a lot of influence on the courts, and they had a lot of influence on poets. They had influence on people inside society who tried to duplicate their processes as culture. And so in Indian culture was hugely indebted to these kinds of teachers.
When we think of culture as a whole, I'm reminded of the three gunas in Sanskrit: Rajasic, Tamasic, and Sattvic. These are sort of cultural forces that blend and mix together. Can you define them for me?
Yes. So the idea is, just as we were talking about vidya and avidya and all these kinds of dualities, knowledge and ignorance, there is the notion of Purusha and Prakriti. Prakriti very broadly is nature. Purusha is conscious being or conscious person. In all human beings have something in them that is conscious.
Sort of like the Atman.
Like the Atman, where it may be a little more qualitative than the person.
Yes.
And you find that a lot inside us is automatic. We have the laws of the body. A lot of it is unconscious laws. We have laws of thought. Even the emotions, and we know psychologists today, we know that predictable responses can be had within a narrow or slightly broader margin.
Right.
For every kind of our affective life, all the sort of moods of our affective life. So
it raises the question of whether we even have free will.
That's the big question. So the assumption in Purusha and Prakriti is that there is something with free will, but it's hidden among a mass of conditionings. And so these conditionings are running according to three modalities.
Yeah.
These are modalities that you just mentioned, tamas, rajas, and sattva. Tamas means inertia. And it talks about the tendency of things to gravitate towards a big sleep, a thanatos, if you want to call it that, something which drives towards death. Then you have rajas, which is a life force which is extremely active, dynamic. It's changing all the time, but it doesn't necessarily have any intelligence to it. It's just changeful.
Isn't it associated with the idea of the Raja or the king?
It is associated with the idea of the Raja because he's a very dynamic person. Rajas, so he's full of dynamic energy. And then sattva is the intelligent principle. In other words, there is a certain kind of understanding involved. There is a thirst for understanding involved in things, which allows us to be effective in the world.
Like a spiritual pursuit.
Yeah. So what we find is that, interestingly, these three are related to the three kinds of consciousness that we find ourselves in ourselves and in the world. So physical consciousness, the material world, without life in it, insentient material world, is purely tamasic. In other words, its base form or condition of energy is inertia. Either it stays, without any movement, or if you move it, it keeps going. Then you have a life energy, the energy that's in plants, in animals, which is largely rajasic. It's got a kind of dynamism. But of course, the dynamism follows laws, but the laws are not apparent to the creature. But in higher animals, there's a greater amount of intelligence. They seem to have a sense of understanding. They take the free will, the greater degree of choice. So that's where sattva has come into play. So in these systems, the idea is that we have to make our consciousness more sattvic. In a way, it's similar to saying that we have to purify our intelligence and make that the leader of our march. And we'll find that will open the doors to an even higher condition, which is free of the conditionings of these three types of automatisms.
So even the pursuit of spiritual truth, the sattvic pursuit, can be conditioned, automatic.
It can be conditioned. There's a very famous parable told by the Indian modern mystic Ramakrishna. He tells this parable of a person who loses his way in the forest and encounters three robbers. They take away all his money. And then the first one says, let's beat him and kill him. The second one says, no need to kill him. Let's beat him and tie him up and leave him there. And the third one says, it's enough that we've robbed him. Let's show him the way out of the forest. So it says these are the three. The first one who says, let's kill him, is tamas.
Tamasic.
Yeah. The rajas or rajasic is the guy who says, let's beat him up and tie him up. And the sattvic shows him the way out, but after he's robbed him. So it's they're different grades of ignorance, but the final one still has a way by which it gives us something greater. We can point the way to something greater, but we can't stay stuck in a condition of sattva. Sattva also is a kind of a righteous ego, you may say. There is an ego involved there. We are stuck still within the automatisms, the kind of the ego of virtue.
It sort of reminds me of a Zen phrase, the stink of enlightenment.
As soon as you call it enlightenment, you stamp it with your human stink.
Well, this is very interesting because we're beginning to point now towards the idea embodied within Sanskrit of the possibility that we can free ourselves from this the world of conditioning that we're caught in.
Absolutely. That's the whole aim of yoga. The aim of yoga is, firstly, how can we free ourselves from the world of conditioning? And secondly, how can we recondition this world so that it experiences creative freedom, total creative freedom?
It's very interesting. We're going to talk some more about this in our third segment, and probably some of our viewers will be interested in knowing that we do plan another session with 3 interviews on the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo. So we'll go into even further depth on the possibilities for human transformation.
Sure.
Debashish, thank you so much for being with me again.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
And thank you for being with us. Be sure to check your listings for part 3 of our 3-part series on the language of the gods.